Welcome to this episode of the Decade Podcast. This is a podcast where we curiously explore holistic sustainability and answers to the question, how on earth can we live together? And in this episode, I speak with Indy Johar. He is the co-founder of Project 00 and of Dark Matter Labs, and he's also a renowned architect. And he really works on those topics of how can we live into a new sustainable reality. And you can expect to learn things about how we can update our worldview, what systems and thinking patterns do we need to change in order to live in a world that is updated in terms of how the ecological world works. How can we reimagine our relationship to property? And how can we think about degrowth in a more holistic sense that might actually work? And expect to learn as well what a philosopher-maker is and why we all need to become philosophy-makers in the change ahead. And I invite you to listen to this episode with an open mind and not an urge to understand every single word, but rather to feel into what this invokes into you. Does what Indy speak about ring true to you? Does it feel true? So with that said, I invite you to a very rich episode and hope you get a lot from this. So enjoy this episode with Indy Johar. Could you, with your own words, describe just what is kind of the field that you're working within? What is that you're trying to do with the work that you do?
I think the field we're operating in is in the middle ground between inner development or personal development required for the transformation and the material development that's required for the transformation. In between there is what we would call as institutional matter, institutional logics and the frameworks, and our tools and devices that we use to construct the implied order of the world, the things that we make, consume, eat, and they're all functions of that. And we are bridging those two landscapes in terms of being able to construct that. That's why we call it the dark matter, the invisible stuff that actually makes the world and structures the world around us as a metaphor. And that's largely what we've been working on for the last 8 years in that process. So it's, we recognize there's great work being done on the development and the transformation of our own reflection of what it means to be human. We also recognize there are interesting technologies being made in terms of the kind of transformation that's required. But we think without those two being bridged, it's going to be very difficult to be able to make the scale of the transformation and transition that's required.
That's very interesting. And that dark matter, could you give us an example to help me and the listeners think about what can an example of a connection point there between the technology and the inner development?
Sure. So, for example, you could make an argument that actually, whether it's Newtonian enlightenment or the doctrine of discovery, or the thesis of dominion, the proclamation of humans have dominion over the world, these were cultural ideas. These ideas then were transformed into what I would say are objectification, separation of things, disentanglement, seeing things in isolation. It then allowed us, in that isolation, allowed us to build theories like perspective, distance, and power. It then allowed us to build classification theory. And then that classification theory allowed us to build registries and property registrars and theories of property, theories of labor as we can stream it. So these logic flows manifest in everything around us, in the private contract, in our theory of property, in our theory of labor, in our theory of governance. These are all constructed out of these logics. And what we're very particularly interested in is how these logics are reaching the end of their life. They're no longer functionally able to deal with the complexity and entanglement of the world. They also were undeniably part of releasing a huge amount of violence in the world. In that theory of objectification and separation, we created the permission space of violence, not only between humans, but violence between ourselves and the planet. And now that violence has become so systemic that it's becoming self-terminating. So we've reached the end of that capacity, or that capability to be able to organize the world. And I would say climate change is just merely a symptom of that reality. So that that end cycle means that we have to start to do a much deeper transformation. It's no longer just about surface level products and services. It's a much deeper transformation that we're facing in terms of that cycle. And this goes all the way, I would argue, and other people would as well, to how we conceive ourselves as humans, but also goes ourselves and how we conceive our relationship with the world, and thereby also how we structure that relationship all the way through. And the other thing I'd say is the science behind this stuff is already there. It's been there for the last 50 years, maybe. People like David Bohm and various other people. The science is not the problem. We just haven't built the institutional logics to deal with that reality. So I think that's I think the kind of challenge space that we're particularly interested in. I think it's a challenge space that is going to be vital, I would argue, for the transformation that we face.
All right. So if I catch that phrase of climate change being a symptom of maybe an outdated worldview and institutions that do not uh, effectively meet that challenge, what would be, if we still use that as an example, the intervention points that you're looking at? How can we then get to those aspects of how we perceive ourselves as humans? How does that not just become an abstraction that people dismiss?
No, totally. So, so what I mean by climate change is is a symptom. It's a symptom of a world which permits externalities and single point optimizations. So, um, our economies are constructed on single point optimizations in isolated frameworks, and the externalities are largely discounted. Now, that could be taken for a can of cola, or it can be taken for anything else. We optimize for largely single point values, profit seeking systems, or other things. And everything else is largely the minimum derivative, either controlled by regulation or social affairs. And that worldview is becoming very difficult to govern. So, for example, if you have a piece of land and a piece of soil, firstly, soil doesn't isn't on the balance sheet of a farm. Right? The soil quality, the soil density is not actually on the balance sheet. So you're not managing for the maintenance and the development of that asset at all, really. And that's because we've had a resource worldview. We've had an idea of infinite resources which we can consume rather than an asset-based worldview. So that's step one. Step two is that if you try to govern that piece of soil appropriately, you would have to govern for the biomass of that soil, the carbon sequestration of that soil, the water purification capabilities, the microbiomes, all sorts of nutrient qualities of that soil. And that all those situational realities would be appropriate for that location and that soil type, that mineral mix. So these are all situationally rooted. They're not abstract realities. And our theory of governance isn't able to deal with that situational reality because what we've done is abstracted governance out to being a universal idea of governance rather than a situational embedded idea. So what we've systemically done is, and this is where Katerina Pessoa does a beautiful thing where she talks in the Code of Capital, where she talks about how we distance the rights of a framework, the profit-seeking value of a system, from the embedded ownership and the governance of that thing. Once you abstract those rights out far enough, the incentives become focused on extraction rather than embodied governance. So what we've created is a net economy system which is rooted in our theory of extraction, and even profit, which is largely meant to be a proof of value function, has turned into a proof of extraction function. And there's nothing inherently wrong with profit if profit was a signal of the regenerative capabilities of the system in which that allocation of capital was operated. But increasingly, profit, certainly in this economy, is largely just a proof of extraction. And what we're seeing is our whole economy is governed that way. So now let's materialize this conversation. If you were to deal with the carbon budget of, I don't know, Denmark, right? You would say that actually, certainly, all of Europe can afford to build 144,000 homes a year if it was to work in accordance with the Paris Accord.
And how many is being built or so?
144,000. 1.5 million a year. This is the constraints that we're not understanding. So once you put the constraint landscape in, it's going to shift how we innovate. And it's and then we're going to have to reimagine how does social justice be delivered? How do we build that social justice in a really radical new way? So what I'm saying is that when you start to focus from single point optimizing systems to multi-point optimizing, you have to start to reimagine quite deeply how our world will change around us. So all the way from, we're doing a lot of work about challenging theories of property, and even challenging like self-owning houses or self-owning cameras. This is about moving power away from abstracted power of ownership, being distanced from the thing, but embodying ownership in the thing itself, which means that you have a completely different relationship with the world because you get intrinsically rooted in the thing itself rather than abstracted. And that distancing, breaking that distancing, I think is going to be one of the big transformations that we'll face as we move from, I would say, an asset and financialized world to an agentified world. And that key to deal with both complexity and entanglement and embodied multi-optimization challenges. And I know I'm being very abstract, but it sort of changes theories of property and it changes even the theory of labor. So the reality is the human contribution can no longer be pre-coded and instructed. So an instructable if you can be instructed to do what is required, most of that instruction quality can be done through automation or other capabilities. So what we're looking for is embodied intelligent contributions from humans, which is beyond theories of labor, where you're looking for care, creativity, complex cognition, synthesis, emotional intelligence. These things are embodied relational conversations which are in the situation. So even the contribution of human would have to be radically different. And I think this is where we start to challenge almost the core orthodoxies of the world that we've constructed around us as a key part of this transformation. And that's rooted in liberating humanity from being a bad robot to actually embracing a theory beyond labor of actually humans as a kind of new form of human economy, which is driven on a new form of freedom, freedom to care, to freedom to be deeply human. And that also challenges all sorts of other orthodoxies of how we imagine ourselves as human, where we recognize, we're a multitude of organisms. Less than 40% of our body is human DNA. So we are a multitude of host and parasites working together to create our consciousnesses. And it's not a single consciousness, it's a plurality of consciousnesses. So this singularity that we've given ourselves is actually a construct that we've built. And how do we start to deal with that plurality, both biologically, cognitively, and most of our intelligence is a social relational function. It's not an individual function. So this starts to reconfigure what it means to be human, but thereby also reconfigures how we unlock a new radical human economy, but also then how do we unlock the human economy in relationship to the world. And that's really critical if we're going to operate in a world where our material economy is going to be massively constrained. It's going to be, we're going to have to reduce our material economy, we have to make it more durable, more circular, more biomaterially rooted, and we're going to have to shift towards an intangibles economy simultaneously, which will be a function of compute and other things, computational capabilities, but also care, emotional cognition, all sorts of other rich uh, sort of intangible economies. And that transformation requires all of this stuff to happen in a different way.
All right. That was like when we get at these aspects of reimagining ourselves as human and of how we view the world, I think it can be very challenging for uh, people to understand how their view of reality as they know it is simply just a perspective. And I want to see if we can start to unpack that a little bit, as I know indigenous cultures have views of how they are in relation to different things rather than our modern idea of owning things. So I wonder if you could speak into that of um, how we might view property now as something that we've reduced into, okay, I own this and I have the right to extract this value out of that, into what you speak of as of how we can be agents and how it has its own value.
So let's imagine a piece of soil has taken thousands of years to grow. Do we have the right to destroy it? And or you can take, say, a beautiful timber table, which has taken, if the timber is an oak table, maybe taken 200 years to grow. Do we have the right to destroy it? And I ask that question in a, the first thing is, do we have the right? The second thing is, imagine being required to be a steward. And imagine being required not to be an owner of the house with the right to destroy, but a steward of that house. See what that does to your psychology of your relationship with the material world around you. Recognizing it is both scarce, it's got huge amounts of energy and put into it, it requires care. And And what this does is starts to transform your relationship with matter around you. When you recognize, we know that, if you were to do, I'm wearing a shirt or t-shirt, maybe 20, 30 pounds. If you were to price it for the total social environmental costs, it's probably somewhere between 150 to 250 pounds. The true material costs of the world around us are massive, yet we treat it like it's waste. And I think what what we're starting to see is that that's no longer possible. That we're returning to an idea of material care as being a key root, and it's not different from your grandparents or my parents' grandparents. They had a different relationship to material and matter. And then if you go back to indigenous cultures, yes, the nation of trees, the ecology was an agent to which you had a relationship and you had a treaty with, not resource to be extracted from. This shift from seeing our ecological systems as an agent, as a being, and a becoming in which we were co-being and co-becoming, meant that we had a different type of relationship of exchange. There was still extraction and relationships extraction, but they weren't rooted in a theory of resource and the inertness of things, which is why they were able to sustain their ecological systems in many ways. So I think this is a foundational transformation in our material economy, and we're starting to see it already. 10 years ago, there was this whole fad about shareable systems. I think shareable systems were the shareable worlds. This was unfortunately still a rent-seeking system because it was about renting to other people. But I think we're about to move into a new paradigm of how we share material and optimize our material economy in radical formats to drive circularity, to drive durability, to drive a biomaterial economy. So we're going to see the birth of a new material economy, which I think rhymes with indigenous worldviews. Not the same, but it's going to rhyme with indigenous worldviews. And I think these multi-eyed ways of seeing, where you see entanglement and quantum type thinking starts to, and entanglement and enlightenment come together to create a new possibility becomes really key. So I see this as a stepping stone and a journey to quite a different material economy in our relationship with that matter. Somebody sort of profoundly said to me, recently, until now I probably could not have appreciated it. They said, imagine if you asked permission from a thing before you used it. And, a 2 years ago, if someone said that to me, it's like, come on, this is really pointless. Right? I'm like, what are you talking about? It's the thing. And the reality is, what I realized was when I was asking it permission now, it isn't about the permission from the thing. It is about the humility of our relationship with the thing. It is about the transformation of me in that relationship. And it's the due care and respect for human ecological systems that have allowed that thing to exist. And that changes my stewardship with the thing or the becoming itself. And I think this idea of what is a 21st century stewardship economy of our material world is going to be a key part. And this will be digitally assisted. This won't be like, we're not going to go back to sort of some pre-world. I think this will be a digitally assisted reality. This will be a new provenance chain of our materials. This will be a different way of organizing our material economy. So I think there's a lots of interesting things at the hybridity of that will give birth to the stewardship economy of the 21st century and a new material economy rooted in that reality.
Mm. Yeah, actually, the first example that I thought of in my head when you started speaking about that was connected to circularity and to sharing economy before I kind of falsified that in my own head of, okay, so if I'm a car company and I either sell the car and have someone else take over the as a property, they own it, they can do whatever they want with it, or if I ask the car company own it and rent it out and take it back and rent it out, then the difference of my incentives of how to take care of it. But the way I kind of thought about it is that, okay, but the lender of the object has a different relationship that doesn't value care in the same way. So I thought we might need to go deeper than that to imagine the new ways of
Exactly.
looking
This
at property.
this is where exactly this is why if you turn it into a lender relationship or a leasing relationship, then you end up with a rent extracting system where one has asymmetric power and it would effectively optimize and extract and de-acidify the economy.
Mm,
This is why, for me, for example, where the car manufacturer builds a self-owning car to which we have a relationship with, there isn't an extraction relationship in that. There's a care relationship with the car because the car will carry on, but it's not an extractive relationship. You have to change the nature of power in that relationship in order for that care to emerge. And this is, I think, really key. This is not the same sharing economy stuff of like rent-seeking systems. It's quite a different radical stewardship material economy.
mm. I find this is also challenging to my thinking to understand how that car has its own self and for us to think, because my initial pop-up question is then, if no one owns it, who takes care of it? And I think you have thoughts about that as well, and you maybe have spoken to it.
Well, absolutely. And I think lots of that stuff can be quite easily programmed. It can have a wallet, it can look for self-care, it can be paid, it can make sure like most cars are 97% non-utilized. 97% they're lying. So the reality is the efficacy that's available from that institution is massive as long as you don't turn it into a rent-seeking system. So there's all sorts of things that are possible. You can build digital wallets, you can automate the care function, you can actually it can even be socially useful. So places which don't have good public transport, it may choose to help. Recognizing its payment structure might be based on outcomes, not in the simple transaction fees. So there's all sorts of things you can do to be able to create the conditions for actually imagining this sort of economy. And in a way, we're probably still 10 years away from any form of functional autonomous car. So I think this is sort of 10 or 15-year journey. But I think if you look at this from the work that we're doing around energy meters um, or self-sovereign surveillance cameras, you can start to code this type of economy already into smaller things, which are less computationally difficult. So I think this starts to create a different economy of things around us, as well as also like, the reality is if you have if you plant an urban forest, if the urban forest is planted by communities, and urban forests are really going to be critical. They have a 90% chance of survival to them being planted by local authorities and municipalities. So actually, the economies of care become a key part of that economy. So we have to build these new hybridities of these new economies of care. So how do we start to build even self-sovereign forests which own themselves, which invite the relationship of care, but also contribute to the macro cooling of that whole city, which reduces energy demand, which reduces flood risk management in different ways. So there's an economic layer and then the care layer, and these things must intersect with new forms of capabilities. So I think the re-agentification of the world is actually a key part of actually us dealing with complexity and multiple value systems and these kind of coordination of multi-outcome systems.
Mm. Does this look similar to how we today think of, I think in English it's called like judicial persons, or like if I have a limited liability company, that's its own individual in our financial system. And does that look like the forest can be its own individual, maybe not with only financial incentives, but what type of incentives does the forest have to not even maximize, but
Exactly.
steward itself?
Exactly. So I think you could start by the intuition we're running is micro digital trust, the digital autonomous trust, trust because they don't create um, an implied extractive model into it. And so they don't imply ownership, but they imply shareholder value in that framework. And I think you can construct these. So these types of legal institutions, and then you have to code them to be multi-currency systems. So not just financial currency, but other forms of currency. You have to code them for relationships of care. So that's the more sophisticated second generation component. So I think there's a whole new class of capabilities for agentified systems that are going to be really critical. And I think there's some very interesting questions philosophically. If you were to draw the long arc of human development, you would say, in a caricature sense, humans were, free tools were embodied agents in the soil. With tools, we became able to leverage asymmetrically a action, a action. With machines, we were able to autonomize that act. We could create repetition of that action, regardless of us being there. But in that autonomy, we lost the relationality because we could plant that machine anywhere, and we lost complex relationality. But we got scale. At the same time, with organizations, we were able to compound pre-coded instructions, whether it's humans or non-humans, into a complex machine able to do this. That was not able to be sensitive because we didn't have the computational capabilities to do that. But we were able to be able to scale these sorts of multi-machine systems around the world. And you could argue that has been the great industrialization, but in the process that created the externalities. Now what we're able to do is not only do that, but we're able to create systems, sort of autonomous systems or machine systems, multi-organization, but with learning capacity. That means they can become contingent and relational to place. So as soon as you build learning capacity and to be in a relationship of care with context, you start to create a new form of economy, which I think is the re-agentification of the world. So we've been on this arc, I would argue, of kind of asymmetric power to agentification. And I think in my hypothesis, I think we're not going to go back to a pre-machine age. So the question will be, how will we embrace? And I think the coincidence or the crossover is a new learning society, which is rooted in both machine, human, and non-human systems, organizing through learning as a key function to deal with complexity and entanglement. That allows for situational variance and situational appropriateness and in new formats. And that, I think, starts to build quite a different theory of organizing our economy.
What I'm struggling to still understand is, um, as we try to take in more complexity and understand different values of, say, an ecosystem or so, the notion of us humans being able to program or make that into computing, I am scared, or I don't understand how we're going to overcome the potential reductionism, the reductionism that is in us trying to reduce it to a single point value in the financial system. How can that be overcome so that we don't end up in another situations where we maximize some value at the externalities of some other situations?
I think this is where it gets interesting. So if you talk to sort of computational experts and other people, they'll talk about multi-optimizing systems. So, and with computational capability, not only can you multi-optimize, but you can also create learning frameworks to support that multi-optimization in a continuous sense. So I think the two functional capabilities that we've got is multi-point optimization, our capabilities to be learning orientated and two, to be able to dynamically change our relationships with the world and dynamic re-instruct. And if we can build a theory of care in that relationship, in our relationship with the world, then I think we've got a very interesting new agentified world. And that deals with the problem that we've got, where we've got asymmetric power, asymmetric machine systems, which are driving huge losses. And I think our capacity to do this will actually be a key part of how we deal with our entanglements, right? So you're right. I think this is why this transformation isn't just a human systems transformation. It's also how we relate to the world, but also how we compute into the world. All three: how we compute, how we relate, and how we transform. And often I find in these conversations, people will separate these things out. They just focus on the human component. So let's talk about how we do our inner development. But the fact is, it's going to require all three of these things: how we compute, how we relate, we contract and relation, contracting into care, and also how we reimagine ourselves to be able to operationalize that. And this transforms theories of organizations. It transforms theories of agentification in the world in a really radical way. And thereby, once you've done that, it also challenges theories of finance, because your theory of finance can no longer be rooted in theories of property. It has to be rooted in a different economy of resource sharing. And that opens up a whole new thing of, we're doing a lot of work around structured economic systems, which is how do you finance 1,000 different agents in a way that isn't about power and asymmetry, but at different forms of resource functions. And that opens up whole new economies of resource functions at the other side.
I imagine there will be people saying, hell yeah, let's go into that direction and loving it. And there will be people who will be like, oh, I'm going to be so confused in how I navigate partly into the transition of this world and also like in a new system where our whole worldview is currently normalized on a financial system, for example. So I'm happy if you could speak into that, how we bring humans along, but also if you want to, I think it might be helpful to speak about also what is happening also currently today with the financial system that we're in. I know you've spoken about how I think you said something like we're currently also in a degrowth economy, just that we're externalizing everything. And I think that might be helpful for people to understand what that means.
So I think I want to start by acknowledging that what I'm saying is not intentionally, but it is unnerving, and it isn't a linear projection, but it's an additive knowledge position that we built over time, working with working with many amazing people, whether it's indigenous communities or technologists or other things. And I want us to sort of look back to, say, 18th century Denmark or 18th century Sweden or 18th century Finland or 18th century Norway. Pick any of those. Any of those, during those periods, if I asked you to look forward for the next 100 years or 200 years, you could not have foreseen how successful the Nordics. The Nordics were one of the poorest economies in the world. And I mean literally the poorest economies in the world. What we imagine as the most underdeveloped economies right now in the world, right? If I was to ask you to invite you to have a picture of that, that is what the Nordics were. I think we're facing a similar scale of transformation. And I think this is where it's going to require both courage, entanglement, and development in a really profound way. This is why Thomas Bjorkman's book, The Nordic Secret, I think is so important. Because without doing the human development work, without building the self-authoring capacity to engage in this transformation, I think this becomes very difficult. So I want to start by acknowledging that, because I think it's really critical that we start to deal with this, because this is not going to be solved at the surface level. This is not going to be solved at the technological level. It won't be solved at the engineering level. This is going to be solved at a much deeper level. The technology is already on top of us in many ways. But the challenge we have is most of our technology is being coded for extraction. Most of our technology is being coded for control, whether bias or other forms of control. Isn't being coded for care. It's being coded. So we are using these technological capabilities to advance a 19th century modality of organizing. So it's not like these technologies aren't in existence. They are. So the question is, are those technologies of control, are they going to exacerbate the problem, or are they going to take us to the path that we need to achieve in the time frame that we need to achieve? Remember, what we're talking about is in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a significant crisis in food. We're already seeing a significant crisis in energy. We're going to be operating increasingly in a dark forest future where we're going to see not only the distribution of power and agency, but also lots of actually vulnerabilities between and fear between civilizations as well. So we're operating quite a different landscape. So the question is, in that context, whether it's food, energy, mineral systems, material systems, all of our systems, foundational systems are shifting. So it's in that context that I think we have to situate this conversation. And then I think, as you rightly say, the reality is that, I often sit in rooms where people talk about growth and degrowth, and I was like, okay, well, let's nail this conversation in lots of different ways. It's very clear that if you were to look at the system level effects of our current growth and you were to internalize all that current growth, i.e., the externalities that we're driving, there would be no growth. We're net extractive of our social environmental system. There is no growth. We're just extracting. And it looks like growth, but actually what we're doing is self-terminating. And probably have been doing so since the 1970s, just to give you a time frame. Second, it's very clear that the Nordic and the Scandic countries, which per capita use more material than any other society in the world per capita, that we are going to have to dematerialize our economies. We're going to have to shift and materially degrow our economies. So our net material consumption per capita is going to have to massively decline. Now it comes to the tricky bit. If you talk to people that perhaps none of us find savory, but people like Peter Thiel and other people like that on the right, they will argue quite convincingly that, and maybe even correctly, that when you drive degrowth in a system, systemic degrowth, right, not just degrowth of a sector, material, but systemic degrowth in a system, the only way to improve my lot versus your lot is for me to take something from you or for you to take something from me, because there is less of everything. The risk with that world is that we will go to war. And so we have to be very nuanced about this conversation. So in terms of actually, and especially in societies where inequality is massively growing, our capacity to do degrowth, if you had equitable society, you could do collective managed decline in a demand of material, our economy in a very particular way. But when there's systemic inequality, it becomes very difficult to do that. So then the question comes, how do you deal with this? We know we have to materially and probably in energy terms degrow our economies for a short period. Maybe in energy terms, we can then regrow it if we can build a new energy infrastructure, but that will take time and won't necessarily be able to be done on the same time scale. You have to start to think about how do you build, and this is about building a new bioregenerative economy. So we're going to have to recast our economy from waste, material consumption, to a bioregenerative economy. We have to build a material durable economy, and we're going to have to build an intangible economy rooted in compute, rooted in creativity, rooted in new forms of capabilities and care and emotional capabilities. And we're going to have to then build the material infrastructure for that economy, so of the compute economy in a new way, to be able to make sure, you're already seeing plays being made, and I'm not a big fan, but I know they're being made. I think Microsoft announced a data center with a nuclear power rooted in nuclear. So we're going to see a new energy material infrastructure for that compute economy. And we're going to have to reimagine it, maybe even from, what would that look like if it was done on by computational capabilities, all sorts of stuff further down the line. So this transformation is a very subtle transformation, and people often go to what I would call simplistic activist theories of like degrowth, regrowth, whatever. But it's a much more sophisticated conversation, and we have to understand the risks that we do as we manage this journey in a really careful way. And that's something I would just sort of say. And it's very clear that we're going to have to make those shifts in those transformations. And also to be able to grow our intangible economy is really critical. 80% of the value of a startup is intangibles, right? So this is not unknown to us. We're seeing, if you look at capitalism without capital, a great book by Stephen Westlake, he starts to talk about this kind of intangibles economy as a key part of the asset class of the 21st century. So we're starting to work down that route, but we're going to have to shift our base, our substrate of that economy in a radical way to be able to make that possible. And we're going to have to shift our theory of value as society. What do we value? How do we value? And that's not a cultural, that is a cultural conversation, but it's also a market conversation. It's about how we construct. This is a real conversation. It's not just banners in a street conversation, which we need to have a really kind of systemic view of the risks that we're facing, the time horizons, and how we do this as a managed transition. And it has massive new possibilities on the other side of it. And I think the human development side I've not even spoken about. I think we're probably facing the greatest human development relationships as, generative AI, machine learning capabilities are going to open up new forms of machine-human capabilities that are not yet on the table. And how do we unleash what it means to be radically, deeply embodied human, assisted by machine capabilities? I think this is a new frontier of human development that's available to us now as we break the shackles of trying to be bad robots. And that's a paradigm in itself. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there that needs to be thought through. And I'm just a bit thank you for asking that question, because I really did want to get into a little bit of the nuance of this. And it can be very easy to sort of take very simple stances, but this does require a really careful um, transition.
Yeah, thank you for speaking into that and to clarify some of the nuances that we need to think about. Because when I think about these things just on my own, I get one or two steps ahead, and then I run into a wall of feeling like, okay, how do we shift this without the system breaking entirely? For me, one of those examples would be, how do we degrow an economy that is largely based on future returns? Just as an example, the stock market I interpret as completely and solely based on the promise of future returns. So if there is no inherent financial growth in the system, how does that just not collapse our current economy and civilization?
I think here we have to be nuanced, right? The problem is the money production is a claim into the future. Absolutely right. The question is, that claim into the future is largely correlated with claims on hydrocarbon energy and material sources, because our economies are rooted in material waste and hydrocarbon sources. So the challenge is that we are making claims into the future which are non-viable. So the problem is not the claim into the future per se, but the threshold, the landscape into those claims. And so one of the work that Emily Harris and us have been doing at Dark Matter Labs, we've been talking about, so how do you build a bioregional banking infrastructure which created ecological drawing rights? So we said these are the ecological limits which can be socially agreed and, with citizens and by representation of future citizens and other actors. And then the banking claims have to operate into those ecological constraints. And suddenly you create a monetary constraint model which allows you to make claims into the future. So you could make a claim into the future to regenerate ecological systems. And that would create a huge positive, so you could get negative interest rate loans on that basis because you're creating a net abundance in the system. So I think we have to start to think much more deeply about what does that economy look like and how do you get it. So it's not the claims into the future that are a problem. It's basically the misdirection of those claims. Because if you could make those claims around, I don't know, if you could find a way of doing sustainable hydropower driven compute, for example, making claims onto new forms of radical care technologies rooted in AI could be very powerful, could unleash a whole bunch of human development capabilities rooted in that, could be very powerful. So it's again about how are we making claims into the bioecological substrates and how are we linking that to the monetary formation period. So these are new forms of conversations that we need to get into.
Yeah, I find this very fascinating. It's opening up my thinking space, and I find that very intriguing and something that I want to delve into further. But for this episode, I think, two questions that I want us to cover before we round this off for today. And the first one will be our
Of
signature
course,
question in the Decade podcast, which is, what would you, Indy, like to encourage to our listeners throughout this decade of action?
embrace being uncomfortable.
Mm.
I think this is going to be deeply disruptive of our sense of self and our sense of our relationship with the world. But at the other side of this, something extraordinary is possible, which I think is genuinely deeply extraordinary. Like, I think we have the pathway to reach a form of planetary civilization, and we have been given the boon of hydrocarbon energy to get us to the precipice of this new form of civilizational infrastructure. And I think there's something extraordinary available to us at the other side of this, but it's going to require us to destabilize our theory of what we think value is, where we assign value, and how we understand it. And it's going to require us to be both sort of what I'd call philosophers and makers. You know, too often we've been coded to only listen to the doers, but actually that's because the doers are only operating in the norm of the old logics. If you're going to operate in new logics, you're going to have to be both philosophers makers. And I think the philosopher makers are going to construct the new world. So open yourself up to actually embracing that landscape from a philosophy to making, which I think is going to be really vital.
Mm. Thank you for those perspectives. And this question came because I was feeling this of how what you're talking to here is kind of helping me open up my current paradigm of thinking, of my understanding of the world. And I at least project onto you that you have a very advanced understanding of the current predicaments and also potentials for the future. And if people like me feel curious to be able to think about this and maybe open themselves up to new ways of thinking, uh, what would be like some initial steps of how we do this? How can we challenge our own ways of thinking, our own paradigms of understanding the world, uh, and while also scaffolding ourselves into new ways of understanding?
I think the first thing I'd say is become more polymathic. This future is going to be at the intersection of multiple disciplines and multiple cognitions as well. So that's one thing. Second thing I'd say is it's really important to craft into these realities. This is a craft problem, not a thinking problem by itself. So unless you're making and learning, reflecting, you can't deal with the complexity. Everything I've laid out isn't a function of just linear thinking. It's a function, Dark Matter Labs, we're 60% building, trying, testing these things, and exploring the edges of these capabilities and what the conversations are, what the limits are, what the political limits are, all sorts of things. So unless you're crafting in this stuff. And the third thing I'd say is you can literally pick anything. Doesn't matter whether it's a food, whether it's planting oranges, or whether it's apples. If you think about this stuff from the theory of what is the balance sheet of the soil, how do you reimagine the balance sheet of your farm? How do you govern it in a really radically new way that preserves soil? How do you build the provenance of these systems relative to climate change? How do you start to be in relationship with these things? How do you build the farmers a trust? You can code this anywhere. There's no perfect place. There's no perfect thing. So I think that's the things I would really encourage all of us to do.
Beautiful. All right, Indy, I'm very grateful we got to have this conversation and for you to shine new light on like very interesting topics. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for everything you're doing with the Decade podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.